Friends, hello everyone. Good, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, and that somewhere is here. Hi everyone. It is a pleasure to have you here at our one of 4 IMH conferences that are happening across North America last week and this week. My name is Elana Stein Hain. I am the Director of Leadership Education at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And from what I understand, all problems and issues related to 50 years since 1967 have been resolved. And so now it is time to get to just the happy, smiley, meaning part of our event. I actually, in all seriousness, feel a real sense of privilege to be able to open a Beit Midrash study session with you on the topic of dimensions or visions of Jerusalem. Starting tonight in Israel already and in many communities across the world, Yom Yerushalayim, the day of the reunification of Jerusalem, will be celebrated in Jewish communities across the world. So to be able to do some Torah learning with you about what Jerusalem symbolizes for us and what it means for us in a moment when Jews are actually in it, not just dreaming about it, not just longing for it, but are actually in it, I think is a rather remarkable privilege. Essentially, the question I'd like us to ask together, though in the format of people learning sources, and then we'll come back together for an actual talk. I'd like to ask the question of what happens when a symbol becomes a sign. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Suzanne Langer is a mid-20th century American philosopher, makes the suggestion that the difference between symbols and signs is really essential. Symbols, she argues, are things that we can conjure up even when they're not there. So the idea of family can be a symbol. Signs, however, are about what's immediately in front of us, and signs inevitably tell us what to do or what not to do. We see a stop sign, we see overcast skies, we see traffic. There are things that we see and we immediately know what to do or what not to do. When it comes to Jerusalem, Jerusalem was a symbol for a very, very long time for many, many Jews. And different parts of Jerusalem were highly symbolic. And in that symbolism, you could conjure up whatever you wanted to conjure up. If Jerusalem meant freedom to you, that's what it meant. If it meant God to you, that's what it meant. If it meant Jewish people to you, that's what it meant. When you actually arrive at the place, however, what happens then? When you need not symbols but signs, you need to know how to govern it, you need to know how to live in it, you need to know how to make decisions about it. And in some ways, the Six-Day War, 1967, the reunification of Jerusalem in a physical sense, brought this tense moment of when a symbol becomes a sign to a head. And I just want to read a short passage, just by way of introduction to help us think, from Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Like Dreamers. Word number 1. Yoel ben Nun approached the Lion's Gate. Spread before him was the landscape of messianic dream. Terraced into the Mount of Olives were thousands of flat tombstones of Jews who had chosen to be buried directly across from the Temple Mount, to be resurrected when the Messiah came. In the valley of Kidron rose the conical stone monument called the Pillar of Absalom, after the rebellious son of King David, founder of the Messianic line. Nearby, embedded in the old city wall, was the Gate of Mercy, through which, according to tradition, the Messiah would enter, and which had been sealed by Muslims to thwart the Redeemer of Israel. Yoel ran up the steep road leading to the Lion's Gate, past the still smoking bus, and through the crowded gate. When he reached the steps leading to the Dome of the Rock, he abruptly stopped. Beyond lay the region of the Holy of Holies. He felt lightheaded, as if on a mountain peak. To move from battle to this, he couldn't pray. Prayer seemed inadequate. What was left to ask for? So, Yoel, what do you say? His kibbutznik officer asked. 2,000 years of exile are over, replied Yoel. Naomi Shemer was in a date grove in Sinai, waiting to sing for the troops, when she heard a radio broadcast of the paratroopers at the Western Wall. They were singing her song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold. But the words of lament for the inaccessible parts of the city had become outdated. The song needed a new stanza. Borrowing a soldier's back, she wrote, we've returned to the wells, the market, and the square. A ram's horn calls out on the Temple Mount in the old city. Mayor Ariel ran down the steps leading to the Western Wall. Any moment, he thought, it's going to hit me. Here I am, fulfillment of 2,000 years of longing. He paused at the final step. The narrow space before the wall was packed with soldiers. Some were writing notes and placing them between the stones. Some were praying. Meir checked himself. No longing, no exaltation, nothing. What's wrong with me, he wondered. What kind of Jew am I? In that moment of reaching the Western Wall and the Temple Mount, these three people came into contact with the collision between symbolism and sign, between their longing and the reality. And I'd have to argue that none of these three people have a particularly complex response. For one, everything is resolved, the exile is over. For another, let's simply add a stanza to Jerusalem of Gold, here we are, we have returned. And for yet a third, I'm confused, I thought that my longing would translate immediately into something concrete, moving, inspiring, but it hasn't. And so the question that I'd like to look at for a few minutes this afternoon, evening with you, is what does Jerusalem mean the day after that? What does all of the symbolism that our Jewish canon has to teach us about Jerusalem mean when we're actually there and have to figure out what life should look like? What elements do we focus on? What aspects do we de-emphasize? How do we come out of an exilic mentality, but not out of a realistic mentality? How do we understand, if we don't have an exilic mentality, what a new center of Jewish life actually should mean? And so that's going to be our job in the next hour or so. You have before you several sources that I'd like you to learn in Chavruta, meaning sitting with the person or people next to you. And I'm going to ask you to think about the following questions when you read these sources, when you learn these sources. Looking at sources 3 and 4, we're clearly looking at a view of Jerusalem that is from outside the land. If anyone does not have a source book, just raise your hand, we will take care of you. Clearly, we're looking at Jerusalem from outside of the land. I'd like you to take a few minutes with your Chavruta partner or partners or on your own, thinking about what themes arise in these texts about what the emphasis of Jerusalem is. What is Jerusalem actually about? And after you do that, I'd like us to move into what I'm going to call Jerusalem of responsibility, of loss, and of hope. And I'd like you to consider those, which are sources 5 to 10. I'd like you to consider those from the perspective of people who have Jerusalem, who have access to Jerusalem, who have sovereignty over much of Jerusalem, who feel that it's their home. And think about what themes arise there. I'll tell you that what I'm going to do is after you have time to learn this material, we're going to learn it together. We're going to relearn it together. But I really hope that people take this opportunity. We've heard from a lot of people. We've imbibed what they think about Jerusalem, about 67, about land, power, and God, about interfaith relationships. Let's figure out what we think about Jerusalem. Each and every one of us, as we're looking through pieces of the Jewish canon, just take this time not to answer my question, but to answer your question. And we'll reconvene likely in about 25 minutes. Okay? Again, if you still need a source sheet, just raise your hand. So in many senses, the most interesting part of the sources that I gave you are the intertexts of those sources. That is to say, what sources they're playing off of and what sources play off of them. So we're going to see if we can do that together. First things first, I want to feel together what we have, what we've taken from these sources. So in the Tosefta Brachot, just for leveling the playing field's sake, so the Tosefta is contemporaneous around the same time as the Mishnah, which puts it, it's actually a little bit later than the Mishnah, so it's about 245 of the Common Era, so it's pretty early stuff, but they're talking about a post-temple world in the land of Israel, but still a post-temple world, so there's kind of an exile kind of mentality. So this Tosefta in Brachot, and then the Gemara, the Talmudic passage in Brachot. Let's talk about the longing, what it is that Jerusalem symbolizes in these texts. What does Jerusalem symbolize in these texts? And you won't be wrong. That's the point. That's part of the point of this, is actually getting people in touch with their own understandings of what they're looking at. What do we have? Yes, please, Sarah.
In Brachot, because I read it at first as Jerusalem being a sign, and you have these circles of being closer to that sign, and the most outer circle is a blind person and someone who can't recognize it directly. They can never actually have the best. They're farther than people who are included in the land of Israel. But then Becca brought up that if it's a symbol, then they're not on the outside. Everyone is focused on the same thing. They can't actually face and see the real thing, but they can have the same experience in the symbol.
So interestingly enough, what you're bringing up is the concrete land of Israel and the concrete city of Jerusalem as a focal point for those who pray, as opposed to the very abstract notion of those who pray towards God because they don't have a direction to pray towards. Am I understanding you correctly? And you're understanding the abstract version as something that is highly symbolic. You can't feel it, you can't touch it, and the facing towards as something that says, that's a sign for me, that's a signpost. Or do you look at the whole thing as a symbol? And we'll get back to that. Beautiful. Yes?
Well, it seems to me that Jerusalem, or the concept of Jerusalem, is aspiration. It's something for which you would strive. And there's a qualification in what we read, because unless you are the good person who is described in the text, you're not going to be able to reach that mountain. You're not going to be able to reach that.
So you're already moving us to the Jerusalem of responsibility. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But even just spending a little bit of time on this text that tells us when you're in Israel, face Jerusalem. When you're out of Israel, face Israel. if you don't know where to face, just think about God in your mind. Yes, Morris?
But this smacks of compromise, meaning Egel HaZahav, the golden idol. After the golden idol, according to many opinions, God realized that the Jews cannot have the abstract religion. They cannot have the concept that God is everywhere and will meditate on him. And therefore, they had to do the golden calf. And therefore, God said, build the Mishkan, build the tabernacle. This almost is saying the same thing. You cannot, God is here, God is there, God is everywhere. Or nowhere in the sense that you above any corporal description. So what do you need this for? You need this because man needs it. It needs a kotel, it needs something.
So you're saying it's a concretizing of something that is abstract.
But
Now,
compromise.
let me just explain something. The intertext, the text that keeps being quoted, Melachim, kings, Melachim, kings, Melachim, kings. The text is when King Solomon dedicates the first temple in Jerusalem. And fascinatingly enough, worth looking at that chapter if you haven't, fascinatingly enough, his prayer when he dedicates the temple is, this temple is not about worship in the sense of sacrifice. This temple is not about who's going to come here by foot and make it into the actual place. This temple is about prayer. This is a place where God hears people's prayer. So much so that he even mentions at the very inauguration of the Beit Midrash, of the temple, I know that we will be exiled to other lands, and when we're in those other lands, we will pray here. He does everything short of saying face east when you pray. Says, we will pray in this direction. His decision to do that is basically saying this is the place for the focal point of your prayers, right? Jerusalem is the place where our prayers are heard. But what's fascinating about this text is not only the idea that somehow Jerusalem would be a conduit to our prayers, and I might add that Solomon says in his version, it's a conduit to prayers of all people in the world as well. Not a particularist vision per se, but look at the end of this Tosefta. The very last two lines. In the Hebrew, Nimtsu'u ha'omdim latzafon, what's going to end up happening is that those who are standing in the north, Pneihem ladarom, will be facing south towards Jerusalem. Ha'omdim badarom, those who are standing in the south, Pneihem latzafon, they will be facing north to Jerusalem. Ha'omdim b'mizrach, those standing in the east, Pneihem lema'arav, will be facing west towards Jerusalem. Ha'omdim lema'arav, standing in the west, Pneihem lemizrach, they will be facing east. And here's the important piece. V'nimtze'u kol Yisrael mitpalalin lemakom echad. And all of Israel will be facing, praying in the same direction. If you can imagine something that's supposed to unify, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, something that ostensibly looks like a theological statement, which is God's listening to the prayers of Israel from Jerusalem, is also a peoplehood statement, which is all eyes are on Jerusalem. All hearts are towards Jerusalem. And I want to just pick these apart for a moment. This isn't the political piece of the talk, that's coming later. But just the meaning piece of the talk for a moment, which is when people look at Jerusalem, there is this mix of religious, cultural, national that is hard to pick apart. It is very hard to pick apart. And there's another piece within that mixture that is a lot more concrete than just the idea that God hears our prayers in Jerusalem, or that all people face towards Jerusalem when they pray. But that is in the Babylonian Talmud passage, Brachot 3a. Rabbi Yossi was once walking in the destroyed areas of Jerusalem, and he decided to pray in one of those small, basically burnt out, old sanctum spaces. Elijah said, I'm gonna protect him, I'm gonna stand there while he prays. So Elijah miraculously appears. When he finishes his prayers, Elijah says, hello, or perhaps Rabbi Yossi says, hello, and they exchange greetings, and then Elijah says to Rabbi Yossi, what did you hear in this churva, in this destroyed place? Va'amarti lo, we're in the second paragraph, and I said to him, I replied in the English, I heard a divine voice, cooing like a dove, and saying, woe to the children on account of whose sins I destroyed my house and burnt my temple and exiled them among the nations of the world. I heard something. I heard God speaking. Because you know what Jerusalem is to me? Jerusalem is the very concrete home of God. God's there. No matter where the people are, God is sitting there and waiting. And he said to me, I swear to you, you think you've seen something, you've hardly seen anything. By your life and by your head, not in this moment alone does the voice so exclaim, but 3 times a day does this voice of literally God who's trapped in Jerusalem. You understand God's people are all over the world, but God is trapped in Jerusalem in a destroyed space. And more than that, whenever Israelites go into the synagogues and the schoolhouses all over the world and respond, Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach, Le'olam Olamei Omayah, may God's great name be blessed. The Blessed Holy One shakes God's head, meaning God shakes God's head, and says, happy is the sovereign who is thus praised in their house. That is to say, I wish my people were here saying that, and not out there saying that. I miss them. Woe to the father who has banished his children. Woe to the children who had to be banished from the table of their father. So I just want to say, as we stand outside of Jerusalem for 2,000 years, for 1,900 years, these are the images and the symbols that come up. It's a place where God will hear our prayers. It's a place where God is. It's a place where people come together. And I've got news for you, friends. Then you arrive. And when you arrive, you can't just hold on to those symbols. They're not going to get you through. So what do we have to do then, once we've arrived? And I say this in the spirit, right before this, we had a conversation about Zionism and religion, and Rabbi Dini Lewis asked such a beautiful question. I did not know you were in the room when I said that. Asked such a beautiful question. She said, you know what's happening? People are moving to Israel, and when they move to Israel, suddenly their grip on religiosity is loosening. Because the religion that they have is an exilic version. They don't know how to do religion in the land. They don't know what it means to be in that place. And what I'd like to suggest is that these absolutely beautiful symbols of this is God's place, and this beautiful symbol of peoplehood, and this is what it means, and this beautiful symbol of God can hear our prayers, tells us very little about what we should do. Tells us very little about what we should do. So let's talk about what we should do. This is where we present 3 different models. The Jerusalem of responsibility, the Jerusalem of loss, the Jerusalem of hope. I'd like to argue that the way that you see Jerusalem, what it demands, not of God, but of us, what it inspires, not in heaven, but on earth, deeply impacts the way you understand politics, deeply impacts where you find yourself on the spectrum in terms of questions of policy. And that actually our canon has a lot to say about the complexity of Jerusalem not merely being a place where, salve, everything is done. There's never been a time when the Jewish people have lived in Jerusalem for more than a few years in which Jerusalem was a salve. Jerusalem is a crucible, and we need to know that. And what we do in Jerusalem matters a great deal. And so the first text that I'd like to present, not of the exilic thoughts about Jerusalem, but the Jerusalem when we're there, is a text that the rabbis actually think sums up the entire Torah. I see we have a question first before we go.
I think it applies to all of these things. Isn't there the crucible that the Shekhinah is in Yerushalayim and Beit Midrash, and when it's destroyed, it's gone? So in here it's trapped in Jerusalem, but the temple is gone. We're talking about coming to Jerusalem, but God is not really there because the Shekhinah is departed.
So
how
you're
is it-
speaking in metaphysical terms of whether God's presence is here or God's presence is there, but really all I want to point out here is things that are very inspiring images sometimes don't help us on a daily basis being able to live in the place.
It's a very live thing.
It's very live, and I want to talk about that life. Other questions? Yes?
Well, we know from Prophet Elijah that he said that God is not in the lightning, God is not in the thunder, God is in quiet reflection. So basically, on the same token, you have Jacob, when Panel sees the face of God. So I think that both Elijah and Jacob show that there is a more advanced stage to get connected to God, and this is rather a more primitive way to get to God.
So I don't know about what's primitive and what's considered more advanced in terms of getting to God. What I'm talking about is the life of a nation.
Well, in the case of Elijah, he makes the effort to go to God, rather than God come to you.
Again, I want to remove the focus from that and move the focus onto what national life looks like when you actually get to Jerusalem. Meaning the day after Yoel Ben-Nun says, okay, exile is over. The day after Naomi Shemer writes her new verse. The day after Mayor Ariel is shocked that he doesn't have this feeling of exaltation, and maybe even he has a sinking feeling that he's going to have to do things that he didn't know he was going to have to do, right? Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to shift off of. I'm trying to shift off of symbolism and into signs, into how do we behave, what are we supposed to do, how are we supposed to understand this? And I'd like to offer, on the eve of Yom Yerushalayim, I'd like to offer 3 different pictures, all of which I think are necessary. All of which I think are necessary for our understanding of Jerusalem and what it should mean. What we're trying to do here is a little bit different than the very black and white, celebrate the reunification of Jerusalem, or be concerned about 50 years of occupation and protest. We're trying to do something a little bit more nuanced, which is, let's understand what having a city of Jerusalem means for us, what it entails for us, beyond our metaphysical hopes, but actually in terms of what we're meant to do. One more question, then we're going to move on. Yes?
Not so much a question as a comment, in that what strikes me is, one, first of all, I would disagree with your use of the words that God is hiding. I think he is residing, but not hiding. Because in a sense, you could say he's waiting for a return.
Great.
You know, when all individuals, when every individual Jew, no matter where that person is, focuses directly at the same place, they're focusing on the very heart of who we are, not merely as an individual, but who we are as a people.
Beautiful, that's beautiful. So let's look at our 3 visions of Jerusalem for a moment and determine what resonates with us in which way. The Talmud in Makot, in Tractate Makot, suggests that there are 613 commandments and tries to figure out where we come up with the number 613. We come up with this number 613 from Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Marsha Kilat Yaakov. Moses commanded us Torah, which really means a teaching, but the gematria of Torah, do we have any gematria buffs here? 611. 611, that's what Moshe gave us. but there gotta be two more to get to 6:13, right? God said the first two, Anochi, I am the Lord your God, and Lo yeh lecha, you shouldn't have other gods beside me, and then the people chickened out and said, we don't want to hear anymore, right? So we have 6:13. The Talmud continues and says, there were 6:13, and then King David came and turned them into 11. Managed to distill those principles down to 11. And these are his 11 in Psalm 15. Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm of David, Hashem mi yagur bi'ohalecha, mi yishkon b'har kodechecha. God, who may actually wander around in your tent, who can dwell on your holy mountain. Now remember, this is a psalm to David. David's whole life was about wanting to dwell on the holy mountain. And God said, I'm sorry, you can't build my temple. So David looks at Jerusalem as a place that demands things of you. He doesn't look at it as something that's in his pocket, that's in the bag. It demands things of you. Who is worthy of being on your holy mountain? It has to be someone who's holech, tamim, ufoel tzedek, v'dover emet bilhavo. It has to be someone who lives in an innocent way, who does what's right, who in their heart acknowledges truth. Lo ragala lishono, can't have somebody who's going to speak slanderously or in an evil way. Lo asal re'ehu ra'ah, who doesn't do bad to their fellow. V'cherpa lo nasa al krovo, and they haven't done things that are shameful to their relations. Nivzeh be'einav nim'as, the person who, from their perspective, a person who is really abhorrent is the person who's terrible. That's who's abhorrent to them. Ve'et yirei Hashem yechabed, but those who are God-fearing, they give honor to. Nishbal harav lo yamir, this is a person who actually can follow their oath even if it hurts them, because they're going to follow what they say. That person doesn't give their money on interest, and they don't take bribes against the innocent. In short, what are these 11 principles? Morality. It's very simple. Morality. And I have to tell you that the Talmud in Makot continues with Rabbi Gamliel getting nervous. He says, oh my goodness. O se'ela lo yimot le'olam, only a person who does all 11 of these things is not going to falter. Who can do all 11 of these things? Aspirational. Who can do all 11 of these things? But the essential question here, and the Talmud goes on to continue and say, not only does Tehillim talk about trying to reduce all of the 613 to 11 principles, which have a very strong moral fiber, but if you continue in the prophets, they reduce the number more and more to 6, to 2, to 1. And what they're doing in each and every one of them is focusing on the moral aspect of life in the land. The moral aspect of life in the land. Now my question to you is, when we celebrate Jerusalem Day and Jerusalem's reunification, how often do we think about our entitlements and our privileges? And how often do we think about our responsibilities? I would like to see a Jerusalem Day that is dedicated to what can we do better. I would like to see a Jerusalem Day that says, we don't just have Jerusalem because we deserve it. We need to deserve it in order to have it. And part of that conversation is not only about morality, it's also about religious identity, but it's an aspect and an element that I think often gets lost, especially among people who are feeling the greatest connection to Jerusalem. Whether it's a march through the streets of Jerusalem, specifically through an Arab quarter that riles people up about the triumphalism and excitement of Yom Yerushalayim without realizing that that is not a moral thing to do. That is not a moral thing to do. Versus those who on Yom Yerushalayim give out roses to people of all faiths, trying to make it a city of unity. And I think this is an important question. The triumphalism and the gratitude for the 6-Day War, which I'll tell you personally, I'm going to say Hallel tomorrow morning. I'm so excited to say Hallel for the reunification of Jerusalem. But the triumphalism that is possible, and the arrogance that is possible, and the forgetfulness that is possible, is incredibly dangerous. This is not something that is ours by dint of our existing. It is ours by dint of our actions, and our actions must speak for us. Jerusalem of loss. How many people here, when they think about Jerusalem and actually having the city of Jerusalem, remember all the people who didn't have it? There's more than one of you in this room. How many people, when they get to Jerusalem, think about how many generations before us didn't have it? Right? Jerusalem of loss. Let's talk about the importance of Jerusalem of loss. Who here recites Psalm 137 ever in their life? What do you say? Where? You're reciting it. Some people recite it before they actually say grace after meals. Tisha B'Av on the 9th of Av, as you said. This is important. The loss that we experienced in Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem, is important. Let's read it and learn about it together in Psalm 137. Al Naharot Bavel, by the rivers of Babylon, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu B'Zochreinu Et Zion. We sat there and we cried when we remembered Zion. And Al Aravim Mitocha, on the poplar trees, Talinu Kinorotenu. You know what we did? We took the instruments that we used in the temple and we hid them in the poplar trees because we were afraid that we would be forced to sing with them and made a mockery of. Kisham She'elunu Shovenu, verse 3, because our captors there, and this is about the exile to Babylonia, our captors there asked us, Divrei Shir v'tolelenu simcha, they said, give us a nice song with your temple instruments. Right? This is, it's right out of Holocaust imagery. Right? You can see it. Put on your tefillin, put on your talis, come out into the street, go into the mikvah so I can watch you. Right? This is what we're talking about. This is the depth of loss that we're talking about. They want to take our most sacred things and march them out into the streets in the most humiliating and degraded of ways. How could we possibly sing on foreign soil? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its strength. Let my tongue literally cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I don't remember you. If I don't put Jerusalem at the beginning of my simcha. What do you mean by don't put Jerusalem at the beginning of my simcha, of my happiness? I must always remember the loss. Never forget the loss. This is what so many people were talking about today, losing the generation that saw 67 as the dominant Jewish generation. You never saw May 1967. You never even saw June 1967. Many of the people in this room did, but most of the Jewish people didn't. They didn't. How do you keep that sense of loss alive? So let's just stop there, right? That sounds good. We're going to keep that sense of loss alive. We're never going to forget that this was not great, this was not perfect. Here come the verses that you don't know how to explain. The verses that make you glad that you don't understand the Hebrew anyway, right? These are those verses. These verses matter a great deal. Verse 7. Zechor Hashem, God, remember, Livnei Edom et Yom Yerushalayim. God, I want you to remember who? on the day of Jerusalem? The Edomites. They're being exiled to Babylonia. Why are they remembering the Edomites? Because the Edomites were neighbors and they watched and did nothing. They watched and did nothing. Worse, they cheered. Sound familiar? Worse, they cheered. Ha'omrim, you know what they would say? Aru, Aru, Ad HaYesod Ba, Babylonians, destroy that temple until you get to the foundations. Okay, so let's stop here. Let's not just remember the loss of those who have victimized us. Let's remember the indifference or the pleasure that others got in watching it. Let's stop here. Nope. Verse 8. Bat Bavel Hashtuda. Fair Babylon, you criminal. Ashrei sheyishalem lach et mulech shegamalt lan. A blessing on the one who repays you in kind, who takes revenge for us, for what you did to us. Ashrei sheyochez v'nipetz et olalayich el hasala. A blessing on one who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. Somebody said that's where I exit stage left. So I have to tell you, these verses, or this verse of one who dashes the baby against the rocks, is actually not a theoretical verse. It's not a theoretical verse at all. In the book of Chronicles, which tells us a lot about the history, the biblical history of the Jewish people, in very little fanfare kind of terms, more like a history book, which is why people don't read it, which is why people should read it, because it cuts out the fat, in a way. Not that I'm calling prophecy fat. I'm just saying that. Chronicles Divrei Hayamim. In Divrei Hayamim, a king by the name of Amaziah, a Jewish king, did this to Edomite children. He actually took them and dashed them against rocks. Not Babylonian, a Jewish king, yes. He actually did this. And most likely, this verse and these verses are referencing that. In some way, may we have the opportunity to do that again. This is very important. There's no one worth their salt who wants to see that last verse happen today. But here's a challenge. We have a two-sided challenge with Jerusalem. On the one hand, we must keep alive the sense of loss and never forget that bad things happened and that people suffered and that we should never take for granted what we have. On the other hand, how do we keep the sense of loss from becoming a desire for revenge? Let me be clear, that doesn't mean a desire for self-defense. Self-defense is self-defense. That doesn't even mean a desire for deterrence. Deterrence is deterrence. That doesn't even mean a desire for preemptive strike. That's back to self-defense. How do we keep the significant focus that we need to have on not just letting things be water under the bridge, from becoming what I'm sad to say many religious Zionist leaders in Israel are lamenting becomes dancing songs at weddings about destroying other peoples? How do we do it? I sat at a table, your table, Spyros. I sat at a table, don't worry, you didn't do anything bad. Nobody, actually I think somebody did, but not you. I sat at a table on Rosh Hashanah when God judges the whole world, not just the Jewish people. I sat at a table and I was talking to someone about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he said, just bomb them all. And I said, it's Rosh Hashanah. Whose God are you? Whose God is this? And he said to me, you are hopelessly naive. You don't know what loss feels like. And you have to protect yourself. This is not theoretical. If you went to somebody in a concentration camp and you say you have the opportunity for revenge, would a person not take it? Would a person not take it? This is important to grapple with, because if we fail to teach the next generation that the loss is real, was real, and is real today for people, we are in big trouble, because there's a sense of being completely buffered from any possibility of danger, and all we need is justice and universal principles, and that's it. But if we fail in teaching the next generation, who is very committed to particularism and survivalism, that we have to be very careful about the limits of that, then we're creating a monster on the other end. And that's highly problematic. And so we need this. We need the Jerusalem of responsibility. We need the Jerusalem of loss. They need to be able to qualify each other. And for the last, Morris, one sec, okay? Because we're running out of time. And for the last, Isaiah, Yeshayahu. What if I told you that you could live in messianic times, but it meant that no matter who you are, you have to accept Jewish messianism? I'll explain. Isaiah tells us, Hadavar asher chaza Yeshayahu ben Amoz al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. That which Isaiah, son of Amoz, prophesied about Judah and Jerusalem. V'haya bi'acharit hayamim, at the end of days, in messianic times, nachon yiyeh har Beit Hashem berosh harim v'nisa migvaot. God's mountain will be lifted up from other hills and will be steady. V'naharu elav kol hagoyim, and all nations will stream to it, flock to it. V'halchu amim rabim, and many nations will go to it. V'amru, and they will say, L'chu v'na'aleh el har Hashem. We want to go to the mountain of the Lord, El Beit Elohei Yaakov, to the house of the God of Jacob. Muslims are going to say that. I want to go to the house, the God of the house of Jacob. Christians are going to say that. Buddhists are going to say that. Hindus are going to say that. Atheists are going to say that. Just want us to see what we have here. V'yorenu midrachav, and actually the Lord of Jacob is going to teach us of God's ways. V'nelcha b'orchotav, will walk in God's ways. Ki mitzion teisei Torah l'dvar Hashem Yerushalayim, because from Zion will come forth teaching and the word of God from Jerusalem. V'shafat ben hagoyim, v'ochiach la'amim rabim, v'chitetu charotam le'itim, v'chanitotem v'mazmirot, lo yisag goy al goy cherev, v'lo yimadu od milchama. And God will help adjudicate between different nations, and there will be peace. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. Like all of the images that I have presented so far, it is fraught. If the Jerusalem of responsibility, the great Rabban Gamliel responded by saying, who can do all of this? It's so great to be so aspirational, but who can actually do all of this? I'm not superhuman. And by the way, the response was, it doesn't say do all of this. It says do this, so do some of it. If the Jerusalem of loss is fraught because we need to know about those who didn't make it and those who today are being struck down, we still need to make sure it doesn't bleed out the other end. And the Jerusalem of hope, fraught. It's fraught. It's beautiful and it's fraught. Universalism, everybody together, peace, it's beautiful. I want to ask you a question. As a Jew who believes in the messianic redemption, what is my answer when somebody says, okay, what happens to Al-Aqsa when the Mashiach comes? You're looking at me very seriously. It's a serious question, don't you think?
No,
No, it's not a serious question.
no, I thought this was strange.
What happens? How do I assert? I'm being totally honest. How assert my right to this place, my connection to this place, my belief, in my case, my belief in my God who has chosen my people to be in this place in a way that will actually lead to universal peace? I don't know. I don't know. But we can't give up the tension either. So what I would say is that if people are celebrating Jerusalem tonight, there's a celebration to be had in Jerusalem as the place where God dwells. Whether God has decided to stay there or go with God's people to different places in the world. There's a Jerusalem to be celebrated as a place where God hears prayer. There's a Jerusalem to be celebrated as a place where everyone looks to. But as you zoom in on Jerusalem, and you really get there, and you really worry about what the stakes are, let's think seriously about the stakes. Let's celebrate a Jerusalem that makes demands, that sometimes those demands feel like too much, but at least we hear the demands and we're trying. Let's celebrate that not as a universal principle. That's a Jerusalem principle. That's a Jewish principle. That's not a democratic Western principle. It's a Jewish principle, right? Let's celebrate it as that, as part of our particularism. When we think about the Jerusalem of loss, let's do it in the right way, whatever the right way is. And let's make sure we don't lose it just because we're afraid it could go off the deep end. And when we think about the Jerusalem of hope, I would advocate for this, that we don't lose either side, the particularist side or the universal side. Because Isaiah's vision is for both. Isaiah's vision is that this is going to be a Beit Elokei Yaakov. This is going to be a house of the God of Jacob. And somehow everyone is going to feel welcome there. So how are we actually supposed to do this? And I'll tell you the good news. None of this is happening tomorrow. That's the good news. Maybe 2 days from now, but not tomorrow. None of this is happening tomorrow. Maybe some of this is happening tomorrow. You never know. It's Yom Yerushalayim. Anything can happen. But the key here that I think is rather obvious, the key here is that I'm begging us to look deeply into what Jerusalem means. I'm begging us. Hartman is begging you. That's what we've been doing this whole day. We're begging ourselves to take a values and commitments gut check, as opposed to saying, let's wait for later. Because when we wait for later, Zionism doesn't come across in all its beauty and complexity. It comes across as a dogma. It doesn't come across in its diverse, splendorous rainbow of reality. It comes across as black and white. And we can do better than that. And the last thing I would say is, let's say you don't want complexity in any of these. I don't want complexity in the loss piece. I don't want complexity in the hope piece. I don't want complexity in the responsibility piece. You want to be really, really one-dimensional about them? Let's be one-dimensional. Responsibility, do the right thing. Loss, remember the loss, don't forget about it. And hope, don't forget that this is about optimism and we can do things for the whole world. Even if it's that, right? They all need each other. None of them can exist by themselves. Too much of an emphasis on any one of them is going to get us into trouble. Either overly naive, overly triumphalist, overly self-effacing, overly effacing of the other. None of these are going to be able to do that. So I want to go back for a moment to where I started. If anybody has read the autobiography of Helen Keller, you may remember this unbelievable scene. She brought me my hat, says Keller, and I knew I was going out into the warm sunshine. This thought, if a wordless sensation may be called a thought, made me hop and skip with pleasure. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over my hand, she spelled into the other word water. First slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motion of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something. Can someone get her a drink of water? Meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowering over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that in time would be swept away. I felt the well house, eager to learn. I left the well house, eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with strange, new sight that had come to me. This passage, says Suzanne Langer, is the best affidavit we could hope to find for the genuine difference between sign and symbol. The sign is something to act upon or a means to command action. The symbol is an instrument of thought. In this passage, there is a celebration that Helen Keller for the first time could understand what a symbol was. Everything was a sign. This is an iPad. This is, what is this? I don't know what this is. This is an iPhone. This is a paper. This is, for the first time, she could conjure it up without touching it. She knew what the idea was. She said, oh, a paper. I can think of a paper no matter where I am. The Jewish people had the luxury of that for 2,000 years. I can imagine Jerusalem. I can conjure Jerusalem up. I can decide in my head what it looks like. Now is not the time for symbology. Now is the time for signs. What signs does Jerusalem give us in terms of how we're supposed to act? Not what do we want it to say, what does it say? What does it demand that we remember? What does it demand that we do? What tensions does it demand that we live with? And how can we communicate all of this more effectively to ourselves, to our children, to our peers? Because that's the only way that Jerusalem can do its work. Thank you very much.